Hey guys, Marauder here, and welcome to a very special episode. For those of you who don't know, a couple days ago marked the 25th anniversary of Nintendo's Game Boy. 25 years ago they released this handheld system, and I know a lot of people will talk about how much certain video game systems meant to them when they got it as a kid, how excited they were when they got their Nintendo or their Super Nintendo or their Sega Genesis or their N64 or any other number of other systems. But growing up as a kid, this was it for me. This was a Game Boy. Growing up, my older sister had a Nintendo, and I didn't have a system of my own. And one Christmas, under the Christmas tree, there it sat. And I couldn't have been happier. I was so excited. I was just beside myself happy. I didn't quite know what the Game Boy was at the time, but my mom had a good reason for buying this for me. As a kid growing up, I had a severe asthma. I still suffer from asthma, but as a kid it was especially bad, and so I'd find myself often having to be rushed to the hospital for whatever reason whenever I had an attack, and it happened quite frequently. So my mom, knowing how much I liked video games, bought this for me, and I had a special little foam case that it would go in with all of its games and extra batteries and other things like that. And so anytime I went to bed, I had to make sure that was ready, so in case I had an asthma attack I could grab it and go. And I can't tell you the number of times that this has helped me through recovery rooms, waiting rooms, ERs, and things like that. You know, it's a little... It's something fun to do when you're trapped in a hospital bed. So for me growing up, this system had the most impact on me. And yes, I knew it wasn't as powerful as the Nintendo or the Sega Genesis or anything else that came out, but I held on to it and I played the hell out of it. By far my favorite. This is probably the third original Game Boy I had as a kid. The first one broke. Somebody sat on it. I left it on a chair somewhere, and somebody sat on it and broke it. The second one, I was actually sorting my room out, and I had it on the floor, and a sister of mine walked in and stepped on it. But this is the original. And so I thought we'd go through a little bit of the history of it, at least from my perspective, and talk about a couple of the games that I remember fondly. But so to start out, this was the Game Boy. This was it. Monochrome screen, only showed basically pea green and like a gray and various shades thereof. It it wasn't very powerful, very limited. Cartridges for them were very tiny. Obviously they've gotten tinier. Game Boy Advance cartridges and such aren't near as big as this, but I mean it fits in the palm of your hand. And they used to come with these plastic protectors that you'd put them in, which was very handy. So obviously Nintendo knew what they were doing when it came to this system. Granted, it only suffered from not having a backlight, which as a kid I don't remember having much trouble with, but now looking back, I can't believe we put up with it. Although when your only alternative to that was something like the Atari Lynx or the Sega Game Gear, and the horrible battery life those things had, and the almost complete lack of third-party support, at least for the Atari, the Game Gear fared slightly better, but nowhere near as much as this. It's just surprising to me that this actually succeeded. And I remember another sister of mine getting a Game Gear, and how impressed I was with the colors and the screen and how bright it was, and it had Sonic on it, for God's sake. But for some reason I could not let go of this Game Boy. As the years passed, it did slightly improve. The first change they did was they did what's called the Play It Loud series, which is they released the same exact system, but with a different colored outer casing. This belonged to my youngest sister who gave it to me years ago after, not using it anymore. But this is the clear Play It Loud, and I always liked this one. I was always jealous she had this because you can look in and see all of the capacitors and where the speaker was and things like that. And it always looked very, very clean, very, very modern, very futuristic almost. It's like something out of, Blade Runner or something like that. But it was basically the exact same system as the original, just with an outer casing that was a different color. And people ate it up. After that, they went to a pocket-sized design, and this was a huge leap in my mind, at least when I originally saw it. Now, this is obviously Game Boy Pocket. This is designed to fit in your pocket. As a kid, you can imagine having this and how, this thing is huge. Compared to the Pocket, it's minuscule in size. It took AAAs. It had a slightly better screen. There wasn't as much blurriness with movement on it. It was still blurry, but not near as bad. It had a better refresh rate on the screen. And it lasted just about as long from what I can remember. I remember picking this up at a garage sale for $5 and just being overly joyed with it. Even though the next Game Boy had already come out, I still played on this. Just for that original, Game Boy feel. After that, they introduced the Game Boy Color. And the Game Boy Color, this was more attuned to what a Nintendo Entertainment System was. This was released sometime in the late 90s, 98 and forward. This was released 1987, I believe. Well, it says 1989 on the back. Well, 1989, and this was 1998, so almost 10 years later, and it's just starting to get color. Still no backlit screen, but some of the games for it were specially made. This is what a Game Boy Color cartridge looks like. Again, very futuristic, almost like the Play It Loud Game Boy that I have. It's see-through. You can see the battery that's in there for the game save. Just as a side note, Yu-Gi-Oh! Dark Duel Stories is not a good game. Not a good game at all, but this is the only one that I have that looks like this. And you could only play these on Game Boy Color. It was quite something to see stuff in color, but on top of that, the Game Boy Color also had another advantage where you could play your original games in the Game Boy Color with some color on them, usually 2 to 3 colors. But it made the games better. There was a game, Donkey Kong Land, that was almost unplayable on the original Game Boy, but you plug it into a color and suddenly the game's playable because you can see your character sprite, you can see where everybody is, and it's not as blurry. The refresh rate on the screen on this was much, much better than the original Game Boy. Obviously, technology had improved. Ran on 2 AA's, and I think overall it looked nicer, and it again fit in your pocket. It's a little bigger than the Game Boy Pocket, but not too much that it's uncomfortable to put in your pocket and carry around with you all day. And again, this is I think they called this the Atomic Purple version. Again, see-through, because I always liked the look of see-through electronics. I always thought that looked really interesting. But the Game Boy Color, this was when, 1998 was when Pokemon happened, and I have all 3 original Pokemon games, Red, Blue, and Yellow. Red was mine, Blue belonged to my younger sister, and Yellow I picked up at a garage sale years later. And I can't tell you, I don't think I bought another Game Boy game for years when Pokemon came out. I would play Pokemon all the time. I knew all the Pokemon names, I watched the cartoon, Pokemon was huge, and the Game Boy Color was a big reason why. Now granted, Pokemon was designed to work on both the color and all the older versions of the black and white style Game Boy. It wasn't until Gold and Silver that you really started to see the Game Boy Color being taken advantage of in terms of the Pokemon games. But I just remember hours and hours, and I would go to school and sit in like study hall or anytime I had spare time and play Pokemon on this. Sometimes my older Game Boy games, but not too often. And then, of course, came the biggest leap forward, was when they went from the Color to the Game Boy Advance. And this is one of, I think, 3 Game Boy Advance systems I own. These things are dirt cheap. This was 32-bit, looked like a Super Nintendo. This was released roughly 2000, and it really took advantage of a lot of features that the other Game Boys kind of lacked. It had much richer color. Like I said, it looked like a Super Nintendo. They were porting over all of these Super Nintendo games to it. You had all the Super Mario Brother games. You had you had special, Metroid games that felt like Super Metroid, like Metroid Fusion and Metroid First Mission and things like that. Again, no backlight, which was a huge thing. But one advantage to the system, something that I always liked, was the landscape design and these 2 little shoulder buttons. No other Game Boy, not even the Color, had shoulder buttons. There's always a portrait design with the screen up top, the controls on the bottom, and it was comfortable. It never was uncomfortable. But the Game Boy Advance with its shoulder buttons, now you had 4 primary buttons that you could use, and games really took advantage of that. Fighting games suddenly became viable on this system. Not that there weren't fighting games before, there were, but I mean, now you had more buttons for more functions. It's a lot more fun. The games came on smaller cartridges, and again, they still kept the Game Boy name. It was completely backwards compatible. You could take any game and just stick it in the back here, and it would work. Granted, it would stick out of the top and look ridiculous, but you could play it. And that, I thought, was always cool. And then, of course, the last Game Boy that I ever had before they started releasing the line of Nintendo DS is the Game Boy Advance SP. This is an original one. I don't remember exactly when I got this, but I think I got it near launch. This was released early 2000s, probably 2002. And it had an actual light. The screen lit up, and it was a game changer. You could suddenly play in the pitch black. I could sit in my room, and I didn't have to have a little light attached or an external device that took more batteries to be able to play my games. And again, fully backwards compatible. You could take any game, stick it in, and it worked. Granted, it stuck out of the bottom, but it worked. Game Boy Advance cartridges, of course, sat flush with the whole design because they were smaller. But the Game Boy was something that I always cherished. And to think that, 25 years ago, that this would lead to things like, the Game Boy Advance SP, or the Nintendo DS, or the DSi, or the 3DS, or even competitor systems like the Game Gear, the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and a whole slew of others, the PS Vita, and to an extent maybe even, mobile phones and smart devices like we have now. I never would have thought 25 years ago. I mean, I'm 28, so at the age of 3, this came out, and I was 3 or 4. You never realized it. And like I said, I used to have my Game Boy on me all the time. Take it to church with me. I'd take it to school with me. I'd take it to the hospital with me. Anytime we had a family emergency, it was always grab the Game Boy and go. And I was always prepared to just sit in a waiting room, or I was good at killing time. As long as I had, battery power in it and a couple of good games to play, I was good to go. But, yeah, a quarter of a century. It's really hard to imagine. And for a lot of people I know, like I said, they talk about how much they liked the Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. But to me, the Game Boy, that was my first system. That was something that I cherished and I had so much fun with. So I thought we'd go through a couple of games. I have a few of my favorites laid out here. Some, of course, being back from when I was a kid, and other ones just being, buyer beware. So I thought we'd go through this deck fairly quickly. There's about 10 games here. First one, of course, Tetris. It came with the Game Boy, and I think it was a major reason why it sold so well. Very simple puzzle game. Anybody could pick up and play it. This was before mobile games, before you'd pay 99 cents for something. You needed something very simple, very easy to grasp and get into, and Tetris was it. I still remember, my older sisters, my cousins, anybody who whenever we had like a family thing would always be, can I play Tetris? Can I borrow Tetris? And I would always have, even when I had my Game Boy Color, I'd always have this with me. And they would say, can I play Tetris? And I'd go, yes. And I would hand them this one. And they would go, oh, well, why can't I use that one? Because I'm busy playing Pokemon. And yeah, Tetris was huge. I love Tetris. Love it to death. Great on the original Game Boy. Next one, Kirby's Dream Land. This is, of course, the very first Kirby game released on the Game Boy. There was also a sequel, Kirby's Dream Land 2, which was also very good. This was one of the first games I ever got with the system. This and another one in this deck that's coming up next. And I love this game. Very simple, easy to play, good for little kids, not too difficult. And I remember it was the first game I ever beat. I was ever able to sit down and get from beginning to end. I remember we were coming back from a party, and I was playing it in the car, and I was getting very, very close, and I was getting a little farther than normal. And I had just gotten to the last level, the castle with the 4 rooms on the side and King Dedede in the center. And I struggled through every one of those mini-bosses to get to King Dedede at the end. And when I finally defeated him, I was just so overjoyed. I was beside myself happy. Kirby's Dream Land, it's the first game I ever beat. It's the first game I ever remember mastering. I found all the secrets. I knew where everything was. And I love Kirby as a character. Funny thing, he's white on this cover because obviously the Game Boy was not a color system, so it made sense for him to be white. But ever since then he's been pink. Not that I ever had a problem with that. I actually prefer him pink, but he's a lot of fun. Another game I got right when I got the system was Super Mario Land. Funny story about this one. This one is actually not my copy. This belonged to my next door neighbor. We accidentally swapped copies at some point. We would trade games all the time, and I think we accidentally swapped copies because it's got his name written on the back in marker. But no big deal. No problem. Super Mario Land, not my favorite Mario game. The music is fantastic and some of the best music in the Mario series. But it doesn't play necessarily like a traditional Mario game would. I mean, you've still got the platforming and the jumping on enemies and the power stars and things like that. But it's just a little awkward because instead of a fireball, you have like this bouncy rock that you throw at an angle and it bounces around the level, or you have these turtles that you step on and their shells become bombs. It's really off-putting. And also, like, the first world is like set in Egypt or something, but I never quite understood that. But I mean, it was nice to have Mario on the go, and I still don't have Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. I'm looking for that, but this was a good portable Mario game. It was a lot of fun. It was certainly unique, and as a kid, I played this to death, and I could walk through it eventually. I knew exactly what I was doing, so that was always fun. 2 more here real quick. The next game, I remember getting this the day I got the system, and that is a copy of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, Back from the Sewers. I was a huge Turtle fan as a kid. I'm still a Turtle fan to this day, but back in the day, the Turtle games, any game that had Ninja Turtles on it was generally a good game. I'll even stand by the NES, original NES version. I think that's a fun game. It certainly has its flaws, but it's certainly not the worst NES game I've ever played. The Game Boy games were spectacular. They were side-scrolling beat-em-ups. You moved the turtles on a singular plane, sometimes isometric plane, depending on the level type. But the boss fights were hard. The music was fantastic. Again, it's really surprising what the developers of this system could do with such limited hardware and still pull it off. And yeah, and it was difficult, and I enjoyed the hell out of it. On top of that, this was one of the few games I remember I still have it, but the Game Genie that was used to snap on the top, and you could cheat by entering codes. This was one of the games you could enter codes with, and you could get infinite lives, and that's how I was able to basically beat the game. But to this day, this is fantastic. I mean, maybe it's nostalgia talking, but I still think this game holds up. I still play it today on a Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, and it still holds up in my mind. And the last one I'll talk about real quick, Super Star Wars Return of the Jedi, or Super Return of the Jedi, whatever you want to call it. This is a port of, I think, the Super Nintendo version of Return of the Jedi. I like this actually better than the one on Super Nintendo. I certainly have a lot more fun playing it. The amount of detail they were able to cram onto this cartridge was mind-blowing. Again, having a system capable of only displaying a very limited palette of colors, it was more like gradient shades than colors at times. What they were able to do with this just blew my mind. And for any Star Wars fan out there, don't pass this up. Pass up Empire Strikes Back. This one's horrible, an absolute wreck of a game. But Super Return of the Jedi is spectacular. Way more fun than it should be, and it's certainly a much better game than you'd expect to get on a portable system. And I remember buying this with my own money and bringing it home and popping it in and just being so happy. Especially since, just before that I had picked up Empire Strikes Back and been very disappointed. But it all was better when I picked this one up. And then, of course, last but not least, the original OG Pokemon games. I mean, Red, Blue, and Yellow. What's there to say? I mean, it started it was an absolute phenomenon. I remember asking for Pokemon just because I had seen the commercials. And one Christmas, like I said, I got the red version, a sister of mine got the blue version, and it was incredible. Suddenly, I was into RPGs. It was one of the first role-playing games I'd ever played. I didn't quite understand at the time what an RPG necessarily meant, what it was, what you were required to do in a lot of RPGs. But I liked the whole evolving your creatures, seeing what they would turn into. This is before, widespread use of the internet. I mean, the internet was out there, but I certainly didn't have 24-hour access to it like I tend to have now. So waiting for a Pokemon to evolve and learning skills and getting around and finding your way into the various cities. I mean, people talk about how formulaic the series has become, and it has to a large extent. But these first three Pokemon games were absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. And I remember I had a copy of this, and I had put it in the pocket of my shorts, and my shorts had gone through the wash. And upon coming out, the battery was dead. I think the batteries are dead in all these now anyway, I gotta replace them. But, the battery had died, and I had lost my save. And it was just when I was 2 Pokemon away from capturing all 150. Or 151 if you use a Game Genie to get Mew, because I did that. I mean, this was I was crushed. I was destroyed. My mom ran out and got me another copy as soon as possible, and I was right back to playing it again. That was another thing. I had a Game Genie, like I said, a device that lets you cheat. And in Pokemon, you could enter a code to get Mew, which was a special Pokemon in the code that you could only get through, I think, a Nintendo competition of some sort. And I was like the coolest kid in my neighborhood at that point. People would come over and want to trade me, and I would trade them a Mew, and they would give me back just garbage Pokemon, just whatever they had to spare of, a Rattata or a Caterpie or a Weedle or anything else they could catch early on in the game, and I would trade them a Mew, and it would complete their Pokedex, and they were absolutely, you know, a lot of people were very, very happy with that. And then of course there was the the 99 item trick using Missing No, and I remember hearing about this. It was like this weird rumor of this strange Pokemon that you could find, and if you did this certain trick where you talked to a guy and then you flew to an island and surfed up and down the coast, and I mean, I don't want to keep going on, but I mean, Pokemon was absolutely incredible, and the fact that it was on a portable system, the fact that it was on such a limited set of hardware, even for the time. I mean, I think this came out in 95, 96, if I remember correctly. I mean, at that point, the Game Boy was 6, 7 years old, and it just gave a shot in the arm to it. And people, I remember they were releasing limited edition Pikachu Game Boy Colors and things that had Pokemon on them. They had a yellow Game Boy with Pikachu on it, and they even went as far as to put out the Pokemon Special Pikachu Edition, which you would, instead of starting with either Charmander, Squirtle, or Bulbasaur, you would start with Pikachu. And I actually liked this version a lot more than Red and Blue, because Pikachu was not the best Pokemon to have early on in the game, because the first couple gym leaders you'd run into, he was either effective against or didn't have any effect at all. Like you'd go to the Rock Gym in the first city and you were completely at a disadvantage. You had to train very, very hard to get past it, and then you'd go to the Water City and dominate. Then you'd go to the Thunder City or the Electric City, and you would again struggle to get through there if you didn't have the right Pokemon. But just the fact that, obviously this was to promote the cartoon, because Pikachu as a character just exploded in popularity. But, I mean, to this day I'm a Pokemon fan, and it is because of as a kid going through what I went through growing up and having these to play on the road. I mean, getting in the car was no longer an argument. I'd sit in the back of a car and play Game Boy games. I never was bored, ever. And, even to this day, I mean, this is an old school DS, but I mean, they released this, and I still call it a Game Boy. I mean, I know they dropped the name. They call them DS systems now, 3DS and so forth. But this is, like a DSi. I always just called these Game Boys. I don't know. It's just something I do. Even to this day, my nieces and nephews, who all have 3DSs, we get to talking, and I'll say, "Did you bring your Game Boy?" And they'll just stare at me. And they understand. But, I mean, I still catch myself. And when Nintendo said that they were discontinuing the Game Boy line, that they were going to switch over to the DS and drop the name entirely, it kind of hurt. I mean, the Game Boy did a lot of things right. The Game Boy did a lot of things well. It was a portable system that was fun to play, had great exclusives, and was backwards compatible through multiple generations and iterations of its own hardware, which, even now with the PS4 and Xbox One, you cannot play 360 and PS3 games on it. And Nintendo was the first one, way back in the day, pulling it off. You were able to play your Game Boy games on your Game Boy Color, and play your Game Boy and Game Boy Color games on the Game Boy Advance. And they had players that would come out. They had the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy player for the GameCube, and you could play your portable games on your TV. It was quite a revolutionary thing. And even though even though they had competition from Sega, from Neo Geo, from Sony, from a whole handful of other companies, Nintendo came through, and it's all thanks to 25 years ago. And it's really, really hard to believe that this led to this and the 3DS. It's hard to fathom. As a side note, the man who created the Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi, who worked at Nintendo at the time, he also helped create the Metroid series, which is my favorite Nintendo series ever. Right after release of the Virtual Boy, and sadly I don't own a Virtual Boy, he left Nintendo and created a company that, I forget the name of the company, but he created a company and designed the Bandai WonderSwan, which was a handheld system released primarily in Japan. And he died in a car accident very shortly after that. And it's kind of sad to think that the man responsible for the Game Boy, for Nintendo's most profitable, successful console of all time, you know, is gone and not able to see where his creation has led the company. It's actually kind of sad. But I can't thank Nintendo enough for the Game Boy. I can't. I wouldn't be the gamer I am today without it. I wouldn't have the appreciation for the handheld systems that I have. I know this video is going a bit long, but I mean, this is a large part of myself as a gamer, is these handheld systems here and all the time I spent with them. You know, so, 25 years ago Nintendo released the Game Boy, and it changed my life. It helped me get through childhood. It helped me get through a lot of really tough times growing up. It's just hard to believe it's 25 years old. Oh well. At least now we can all still be playing our 3DSs and Vitas.